This morning on The Real Story, the war between Hamas and Israel, killing thousands, but leaving an even greater emotional impact. From the rubble of Gaza to right here in Connecticut. As we cover the conflict, we're sitting down with an expert to get into the nuance, the history, and answer your questions. But first, what people are calling an energy crisis here in Connecticut. As costs rise and new challenges come, we're speaking with two of Connecticut's leading lawmakers when it comes to energy, from supply to your bill and sustainable investment. We're getting into it all this morning on The Real Story. Good morning, and thanks for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wolforst. We've been closely covering what many are calling an energy crisis in Connecticut, from infrastructure to your rates. Joining us now to break it all down, Republican Senator and Ranking Member on the Energy and Technology Committee, Ryan Fazio, and Democratic Chair of the same committee, Senator Norm Needleman. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Of course. So we know Connecticut has some of the highest energy costs in the country, and several of the companies are asking for even higher rates. They're asking for some hikes, but the state has denied them. We've been covering specifically United Illuminating recently, breaking it down, talking to the Attorney General. You both were advocates for the state's new performance-based regulations. So first, can you tell us what that looks like, what changes, what is performance-based regulation?
Well, first of all, I just want to extend prayers to everyone who was negatively affected by the terrorist attacks in Israel. I think everyone's prayers and support across Connecticut is extended towards them. As you said, Connecticut suffers from some of the highest electricity costs in the entire country, but also we want to make sure that people are getting adequate service for everything that they pay for. So a couple of years ago, the legislature passed something called performance-based regulation that Senator Needleman was integral in writing and designing, and it's an ongoing docket before PURA. And basically the concept is you shouldn't just have to pay for cost of service, but you should be able to pay for performance. So if the utilities fail at providing you an adequate level of service, they should see their recovery reduced. At the same time, if they do a good job, they should be able to receive a higher rate of recovery. Therefore, we're just not incentivizing our utilities to spend more money, but also to provide the best quality of service to our consumers possible.
Right. Anything to add in there?
Yeah, no, I want to reiterate what Senator Fazio said about, as a Jewish American legislator, what's been going on for the last 5 days is enormously agonizing, heartbreaking, and memories come back of the Holocaust and all the people that were lost. And any argument about sympathy for Palestinians, unfortunately, gets overshadowed by the brutality of murdering innocent civilians deliberately. So having friends and family that lives there, my heart goes out to them. And,
absolutely.
With regard to PBR, performance-based rate making, we did author a bill called Take Back Our Grid several years ago. There were a lot of parts to it. Performance-based rate making was not all of it. And we handed that off to PURA and asked them to write the regulations, and they are working on that now. Those standards hopefully reward good performance with more money and penalize bad performance with less money. And I think that we're leaders in that. Just circling back to your first comment about highest rates in the country, the Northeast has higher rates than a lot of the rest of the country because the Northeast of the United States is pretty much aligned on climate goals and goals for energy efficiency. So we see some of those costs in there. But when you look at the average bill price, it's not as bad as it looks in terms of the absolute rates. So we make big investments, and those investments hopefully will help us save energy and at the same time move forward on decarbonization of our grid.
Right. So let's talk specifically about UI here. Senator Needleman, you've spoken before about the lobbying and leveraging that the company has been trying to get approval for their rate hikes. Pura, of course, deciding UI did not show enough evidence that these rate hikes were needed. What would an energy company need to show or present in order to get those rate hikes approved?
So, not a regulator. We authored new legislation that, again, seeks to hold the utilities more accountable because there's a widely perceived feeling in the state of Connecticut that the ratepayers were not getting the best value for their money. There are some aspects of the electric bill that the utilities are responsible for since deregulation, some aspects of the bill that they're not responsible for. But the reality is the consumers of the state of Connecticut do not necessarily feel after a storm or when incidents occur that the utilities are responding adequately to their needs. So we've sought to correct that. I think the question about what you should expect should be more directed at Pura, but I look at it from a high level, thinking that value, right? Not the cheapest, not the most expensive, but the most value. And holding the utilities accountable, making sure that the earnings of the corporations, the earnings of the management there is measured against what the ratepayers are experiencing on the ground. And I think that these utilities haven't been widely perceived to be considering the interests of the ratepayers as their highest priority.
Do you think, though, that it could be said, less money might equal worse storm preparedness, as you were just saying, as we're looking at this and ratepayers are how they're perceiving it? How do you feel sort of, go to Senator Fazio, how do you feel sort of that perception plays into, the money that these companies are getting?
Well, the economic arrangement should be fair. You have to balance quality with cost, and as Senator Needleman said, get the best value for consumers. And I think that's what smart regulation is about. And there's going to be disagreement at times, but I think proper regulation and proper statute will get the best value for our consumers. A good quality, a high level of service at a reasonable cost. And I think historically in Connecticut, we haven't had that. The regulations haven't been enforced in a manner that have gotten the best quality of service for Connecticut residents from our utilities, and we've been paying extremely high rates for that service nonetheless. So hopefully performance-based rate making, as well as Senate Bill 7, which we co-authored and passed this year, will move us towards a system where there's a high level of accountability, a high level of value, and there's a fair level of return on investment in the state as well.
Yeah. So we have seen some serious concern come, from both you and your colleagues, as well as these energy companies, when it comes to grid capacity. This is something UI said they would need the rate hike for, as well as Eversource, and the state said it should be a priority. So what could be the possible solution here?
Well, I think down the road, 10, 20 years, the state and the region are going to suffer from a high imbalance of demand and supply, which will either result in shortages of electricity or much higher rates. So we need to make sure we make smart investments and upgrades to the grid in order to ensure there's as little kind of drop off in electricity transmission as possible. So we increase supply. We need to make sure that we're increasing generation of affordable electricity and reliable electricity, while also ensuring that we aren't juicing increasing demand too much. We're going to have a natural increase in demand with the electrification of more heat and vehicles, but we shouldn't overly subsidize that demand at the same time. So, we're in a very tenuous situation in this region, and 10, 20 years down the road, insufficient demand is going to be a problem. High costs are going to be a problem. So we have to be strategic about what we do now, because it'll affect costs and reliability 10, 20 years from now.
And for both of you, as we're talking about grid capacity here, I know this is an even bigger topic. I'm sure we could have a whole segment just about this, but something with electric vehicles, it's been, a big sustainable goal for the state, and we've seen a lot of discourse about this. But, quickly from both of you, we'll start with Senator Needleman. Does the state have the grid capacity to support electric vehicles, especially in the way that the state is trying to set this large goal?
Mm-hmm. So I just want to circle back to your earlier point about what the utilities have said.
Right.
It is not a good situation to be in, to have the feeling that there's a gun to our head, that if we ask you for more money and you don't give it to us, we're not going to perform. I own a business. I supply products to some of the largest retailers in the world, and they would never say that. They have expectations that you should get more out of what you do and improve efficiency. So that's why you have a good regulator in place, to make sure that they get, the three bears, not too much, not too little, just enough.
Right.
With regard to the goals that are being set for electric vehicles and other things that are coming down the pike, we're setting them out far enough to send messages to the industry. We're not the spear point here. These are California standards. By the time these are enacted, 50% of all the ratepayers in the country, all the citizens of the country, are going to be under these same standards. And I'm confident that we will get to where we need to be. But if we don't send the signals to the industry now, we're never going to get there. They need to know the car makers are on board with this, which is, I think, one of the critical things. But there's a lot of work to be done. This is not a switch that you flip on. 12, 13 years, nothing is carved in stone. If we needed to make some adjustments in 2030, we could do that. But right now, I think we're looking at sending signals to the markets and letting people know what our goals are and align them with many, many other states in the country.
Yeah. And Senator Fazio, I know a lot of Republicans have kind of raised alarm bells around this, saying we shouldn't have the same regulations as some other states. I know Senator Needleman mentioned California, the Connecticut should have their own sort of goals. Do you think it's enough time? Do you think the grid capacity can support something like this?
I don't. First of all, I think electric vehicles are a good thing, and I am rooting for a higher proliferation of them, and I've even supported regulation that will increase the proliferation of electric vehicles in the state. But I think mandating that all new vehicle purchases in 12 years are all electric takes away choice from consumers. It'll increase the cost of buying a car, which is very difficult, especially in a state with such a high cost of living already, where people haven't gotten a raise in many years. But also, it'll add gigawatts of demand to an electric grid, which is going to see a doubling of demand in 25 years anyway, and it just doesn't seem like we're going to have the electrical supply in order to balance supply and demand, which means we're going to have much higher electricity rates, or we're going to have shortages. And so, even though it is 12 years out, I think the heavy-handed characteristic of the measure, coupled with the fact that we're slated to see shortages of electricity 10, 20 years down the road, make it, undeniably a bad decision. We should make our own policy here in Connecticut rather than copying and pasting from a place like California.
And with energy supply, you obviously both work to try and lower prices for your constituents, but you also have a lot of insight into these companies and their operations. If we really start to look at these prices, whether it's current costs now or proposed costs in the future, do you feel these high costs are coming from business model, or is it coming from root causes like the cost of the energy supply? We'll start with you.
I think it is complicated. I think mostly in the Northeast, we can expect to have higher energy costs than the rest of the country because of our geographical limitations. Right. But I also think there is a role in public policy that has inflated our energy costs generally in the Northeast. At the same time, public policy reforms could help us lower electricity costs in the future. I think some of the bipartisan measures that we adopted in SB 7 will lead us towards lower costs, or at least limit the cost increases, including I think the smarter regulation, as well as reforming the renewable portfolio standard to incorporate more hydro and nuclear into our energy portfolio.
Okay.
So there is a role for better policy. I think Connecticut, with reforms, can have better policy and lower costs.
I hate to keep doing this, but I want to circle back. The 2035 standards allow for hybrid vehicles, which I think, looking at this from somebody who's driven cars for 55 years, a hybrid is a good option where your local driving is done on battery, and then your long-distance driving is done on a gasoline engine. Because most driving is more local, except for my good colleague here who has to drive up here from Greenwich every day. But I also want to speak about all the pieces of the puzzle that make the supply-demand equation a little bit different. One of the things that Connecticut has been working on for several years, not necessarily with the most cooperation from our utilities, is something called advanced metering. If Yankee ingenuity says if you got free electricity from 2 to 4 in the morning, you'll be up at 2 o'clock in the morning doing all your wash, right, and running your dryer. It will never be free, but time of day costs are going to be a critical element. So one would hope that things like charging your vehicles, smart appliances, are going to allow you to do things when the electric rates are lower. If you look at the curve over the course of any given day, there are peaks in that curve. And the most efficient electric grid is one that's flat, where the use over the course of 24 hours is the same. Because otherwise, they're firing up plants, they're shutting off plants, you're paying for unused capacity. You want to really get at the root cause of this. We got to level, flatten out that curve as much as possible and provide advanced metering, but do it correctly. One of the utilities was given money for advanced metering a number of years ago, and the way they deployed it didn't provide what was expected. And that's part of the issue of having a regulator that looks at, we give you money ahead of time, and then we expect results. And when we come back for another rate case, and then the results are not there, you can't take the money away that you gave them, but you can say, I'm not giving you any more. So I think that there are ways to make this whole grid more efficient, and I think that's what's being worked on right now, and I'm confident that we will get there.
And obviously, it's a continuing conversation. Unfortunately, all the time we have, we'll have to have you both back on to keep talking about this, and I know this will be talked about again into February when you both come back up for the next session. But thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's still more to come here on The Real Story. We're talking about the devastation in the war in Israel, how its impacts have been felt, where strikes hit to thousands of miles away right here in Connecticut communities. As questions arise from what's happening in the region to what America's role could be in the coming weeks, we're answering your questions and breaking it all down with an expert ahead.